Welcome to the Unraveling the Scriptures channel. What if I told you that there are books so ancient, so revealing, that history has silenced them? Manuscripts that tell of secret alliances, celestial rebellions, and giants who terrorized humanity. For centuries, these texts were considered too dangerous, too powerful. Books like the Book of Jubilees, the enigmatic Book of Jasher, and the impressive Book of Giants. But why were they hidden? What could these forgotten pages reveal about the beginnings of the world? About the war between the sons of men and the beings who came from the heavens? Today, we will pierce the veil of forbidden history. We will rediscover the secrets that were buried and understand why, to this day, many prefer that they remain forgotten. 3 banned books of the Bible you need to know about. The Pentateuch, composed of the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, is traditionally attributed to Moses as its author. This belief is widely accepted both by religious tradition and by many scholars. However, the question arises, could Moses have written other texts besides these 5 books? Or did he already have access to other writings that were not his own? For example, in later texts like the Book of Joshua, we find intriguing references such as the Book of the Just or Book of the Righteous. This same book is also mentioned in passages from 2 Samuel and 1 Kings. But what exactly was this sacred text? There is a possibility that Moses had access to other ancient writings which might not have been produced by him. Considering that Moses lived for 40 years in Midian, in the house of a priest who also served the God of Israel, it is plausible to imagine that he had contact with manuscripts or older traditions. This priest possibly preserved records or texts related to the worship of the one true God. Furthermore, tradition attributes the writing of the Book of Job to Moses, whose narrative is set in a period earlier than his own time. This reinforces the hypothesis that there were already other religious or historical texts among the Semitic peoples, many of whom maintained faith in monotheism and the Almighty God. It would not be surprising if texts like Job, possibly written by the protagonist himself or by other authors, circulated in communities dedicated to preserving this faith. Thus, it is fascinating to think about the cultural and spiritual richness of the Semitic peoples of that time, as well as the possibility that Moses was both an author and a compiler of written traditions that date back to even older times. The Book of the Just, as it is known in English Bible translations, is referred to in the original Hebrew text as Sefer HaYashar and in Aramaic as Sifra Diashar. Both expressions can be translated as the Book of the Righteous or the Book of the Just. It is a text considered lost from the sacred scriptures, traditionally associated with the Hebrew and Aramaic Bible, whose existence is widely recognized but whose preservation has been lost for centuries. It is important to highlight that, throughout history, several forgeries have emerged claiming to be rediscovered copies of this lost book. These apocryphal versions were produced at different times and by different authors, but none of them are considered authentic. To this day, there is no manuscript that can be confirmed as a true copy of the Book of the Just, reinforcing the idea that the original text is completely lost. Despite this, the Book of the Just is widely mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, with at least 2 direct references in Old Testament texts. A third mention is also frequently associated with the Book of Kings, although there is debate over its interpretation. These references point to the historical and spiritual importance of this lost document, which presumably contained records of significant events or valuable teachings related to the Hebrew tradition. The first mention of the Book of the Just occurs in the Book of Joshua. According to Joshua 10:13, during a battle against Adoni-Zedek, king of Jerusalem, and his allies, Joshua prayed for the sun and the moon to stop. The verse states, "And the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, until the people had avenged themselves upon their enemies." Is not this written in the Book of Jasher? This passage suggests that the event recorded in Joshua 10:13 had already been documented in an older text, identified as the Book of the Just. This reference is particularly interesting because it seems to suggest that Joshua 10:13 was taken from a pre-existing text. This reinforces the idea that the Book of Jasher was not only an earlier work, but also contained accounts of important historical and miraculous events significant to the Hebrew tradition. The second mention of the Book of Jasher appears in 2 Samuel 1:18. In this context, David laments the death of Saul and Jonathan and introduces his lament with the words, "To teach the children of Judah the use of the bow. Behold, it is written in the Book of Jasher." This verse suggests that the book contained poetic or instructional records used as a source for transmitting cultural and military traditions. Additionally, there is a linguistic curiosity regarding the translation of the Book of Jasher. Solomon's prayer, mentioned elsewhere in the scriptures, is attributed to the Book of Songs, or Sefer Hashir. Some scholars speculate that Sefer Hashir and Sefer Hayashar could be variations of the same title, with subtle differences in the Hebrew writing, such as the transposition of letters. These references suggest that the Book of Jasher played a significant role in preserving historical events, hymns, and important teachings for the Israelite tradition. Although it is lost, it appears to have been a rich and multifaceted source, encompassing records of battles, laments, and possibly liturgical songs. According to Alexander Rofer, the name Sefer Hayashar might be related to its original function as a compendium of songs, prayers, and other liturgical or historical texts. This perspective suggests that the title, Book of the Just, reflects the intent to record religious and cultural practices significant to the Israelite tradition. However, many forgeries of works claiming to be the true Book of Jasher have emerged. Among them is the so-called Pseudo-Jasher, as well as the widely known Hebrew Midrash Sefer Hayashar. The latter is a work that narrates the biblical story from the creation of Adam and Eve to a summary of the initial conquest of Canaan by the Israelites, as described at the beginning of the Book of Judges. Although the Bible mentions Sefer Hayashar on two specific occasions, the reference to the sun and moon in Joshua 10:13 and the instruction about the bow in 2 Samuel 1:18, the Midrash Sefer Hayashar seems to be a later composition. It is widely accepted that this work was created by rabbis in a period much later than the original scriptures. Despite this, it includes passages that align with the biblical references, leading some to question if there might be an indirect connection with the lost text. For example, the mention of the sun and moon in the Book of Joshua and the instruction to teach the children of Judah to fight with the bow in 2 Samuel are found in the Midrash Sefer Hayashar, specifically in chapter 56, verse 9. This passage situates these words among Jacob's final declarations to his son Judah, a detail that reinforces the idea that the text was rearranged or interpreted to align with the biblical references. However, the academic consensus suggests that the Midrash Sefer Hayashar is not the true Book of Jasher, but a literary work that combines biblical narratives and midrashic traditions, likely created to fill gaps and enrich the understanding of biblical stories for later readers. When analyzing the Book of Jasher, also known as Midrash Sefer Hayashar, it becomes clear that it is a rabbinic work composed long after the time of Moses. Various textual clues reveal its later origin, such as in chapter 10, where the descendants of Noah are mentioned. Interestingly, the text uses medieval names to designate territories and countries, such as Franza for France and Lombardy for Lombardy, a region in Italy. This anachronism already indicates that the Midrash Sefer Hayashar was written in a historical and cultural context significantly later than the biblical period. Additionally, the text shows similarities to Josipon, a rabbinic work from the 10th century, which also lists various peoples and territories of medieval Europe. This connection is evident not only in the content, but also in the narrative style, reflecting the literary and intellectual traditions of the medieval period. Many of the extra-biblical accounts found in this midrash appear in similar forms in other sources of the time, such as the Talmud, other midrashim, or even Arabic compilations. One example is the story of Lamech and his son Jabal, who, according to tradition, accidentally killed Cain, thus fulfilling a kind of divine justice for the death of Abel. This narrative is widely disseminated in different traditions, reinforcing the idea that the Midrash Sefer HaYashar is more of a compilation of stories and interpretations than an original and authentic source. Therefore, the Book of Jasher, in its current form, is widely recognized as a medieval rabbinic creation that combines biblical elements, Jewish traditions, and external influences, such as Arabic sources. Although it has significant cultural and literary value, it cannot be considered the true Sefer HaYashar mentioned in the sacred scriptures. The main discrepancies between the Book of Jasher, or Book of the Just, and chapter 5 of the Book of Genesis are notable and lead to some confusion regarding the names and dates mentioned. First of all, the Book of Jasher states that a son of Seth passed away in the 84th year of Noah's life, referring to him as Enoch, while the biblical text of Genesis identifies this son as Enosh. Additionally, in Jasher, Enoch, actually the son of Jared, is confused with Enos, creating a significant disconnect between the two sources. Another important discrepancy concerns the dates of death for Jared and Lamech. According to Jasher, Jared died in the 336th year of Noah's life, whereas Genesis states this number as 366. As for Lamech, the Book of Jasher claims he died in the 195th year of Noah's life, instead of the 595th year described in Genesis. Furthermore, Jasher presents different lifespans for Lamech, 770 years rather than 777 years as in Genesis, and Methuselah, 960 years instead of the 969 years indicated in Genesis. These variations in numbers and chronological data make the Book of Jasher full of discrepancies when compared to the biblical text. The Book of Jasher also shows characteristics that suggest it was written in a later period, likely between the 15th or 16th centuries, possibly in Italy. This historical context explains some of the differences from older biblical texts and also illustrates how the version of the book was influenced by later traditions and understandings of biblical genealogy and narratives. One example of this is the genealogy of Abraham, where Jasher omits the mention of Canaan between Arphaxad and Shelah, a difference that aligns the book with the Masoretic text and the Samaritan Pentateuch, but conflicts with the Septuagint and the genealogy of Jesus, as recorded in Luke chapter 3. Another significant divergence can be observed in the account of God's test for Abraham involving his son Isaac. In the Book of the Just, chapter 23, verses 50 to 51, when Isaac sees the fire and the wood and asks Abraham about the lamb for the burnt offering, Abraham's response is quite different from the one found in Genesis. Jasher states that Abraham replied, "The Lord has chosen you, my son, to be a perfect burnt offering in place of the lamb," which completely contrasts with the answer given by Abraham in Genesis, where he simply says, "God will provide himself a lamb for the burnt offering." These variations are not merely matters of interpretation, but rather indicate that the Book of Jasher, in addition to containing clear discrepancies with the traditional biblical account, may also reflect cultural and religious influences from a later period. Therefore, we can assert that this Midrash, known as the Book of the Just or Sefer HaYashar, is nothing more than a pseudo-epigraph, meaning a work with a false authorship, claiming to be an ancient and sacred text, but lacking historical or genuine backing. It is a text that, despite being attributed to biblical figures like the righteous, is widely considered a literary work of later origin, with various inconsistencies and distortions when compared to the Bible. The true Sefer HaYashar has been lost over time, but perhaps with recent archaeological discoveries, such as the Dead Sea Scrolls and other textual finds, we may still find traces, or even the lost book itself. Archaeology has uncovered many ancient texts, some over 2,200 years old, which makes us believe that recovering authentic biblical documents, like the Sefer HaYashar, is still a real possibility. Given the nature of discoveries made in archaeology and manuscript studies, I have no doubt that more revelations may occur in the future. Still, The Book of the Just remains full of inconsistencies, with various points that conflict with the sacred texts. One example is the narrative about Moses after he killed the Egyptian and fled from Pharaoh. According to this Midrash, Moses did not flee to Midian, as described in the Book of Genesis, but to the land of Cush, a region corresponding to modern-day Ethiopia or Sudan. Additionally, Moses' age is altered. The text states he was 18 when he fled, instead of the 40 years mentioned in Genesis. These discrepancies are evident and highlight the distance between this tradition and the biblical account. Another controversial point in the Midrash is that in the land of Cush, Moses was made king at the age of 27 and reigned for 40 years, being deposed at the age of 67. This episode presents even more divergences with the sacred texts, where Moses' journey is different. The Midrash also states that Moses confronted a sorcerer named Bilam, identified with Balaam, who caused a plague of serpents that bit the people of Ethiopia. Moses then used large birds to capture and destroy the snakes in order to save the people. This account is entirely atypical when compared to the biblical stories of Moses, where he does not have such a fantastical encounter with serpents. Furthermore, according to this text, Moses married a woman named Adoniah, a detail that is unsupported by the biblical texts, where Moses' wife is described as Zipporah, the daughter of Jethro, the priest of Midian. These differences clearly demonstrate that the Book of the Just, although influential in some Jewish and other religious traditions, is not a canonical text nor a reliable historical source. Its nature as a later literary work is evident, and while its reading may offer interesting alternative accounts and interpretations, we cannot consider it a faithful representation of biblical events. The text is completely disorganized regarding the chronology and geography presented in the Book of Genesis. In reality, Moses went to the land of Midian, which corresponds to the northern region of Saudi Arabia, where he married the daughter of Jethro, a priest of the Almighty God. Therefore, this Midrash is nothing more than a pseudo-epigraph, a false and misleading text. Now, I would like to know your opinion. Do you believe in this Sefer HaYashar Midrash, or the other books of the just that are considered the true Book of the Just? Or do you agree with me that this text disappeared and was lost long ago, but could still be found? The Book of Jubilees is often referred to as the Little Genesis or Second Genesis due to its reinterpretation and narrative expansion of the events described in the Book of Genesis. This ancient Jewish text, composed of approximately 50 chapters, is considered canonical by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and the Beta Israel Jews, who refer to it as the Book of Divisions. In ancient Ethiopian, Ge'ez, it is known as Metzhafe Negest. The Ge'ez language, an ancient Ethiopian tongue belonging to the Afro-Asiatic family, also known as Hamito-Semitic, is linguistically related to the languages of the descendants of Shem, the son of Noah, and Ham, his brother, highlighting a rich historical and cultural connection in the region. The Book of Jubilees played a significant role in the religious and cultural thought of early Christians. It is mentioned in the works of several ancient authors, including Epiphanius, Justin Martyr, Origen, Diodorus of Tarsus, Isidore of Alexandria, Isidore of Seville, Eutychius of Alexandria, John Malalas, Euthymius the Flamens of Constantinople, and George Cadrenos, demonstrating its wide influence. Moreover, this text was of great importance to the community that preserved the Dead Sea Scrolls. Although no complete versions in Greek or Latin have survived, the Ge'ez translation has proven to be a reliable source, showing fidelity to the fragments found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. The work presents a chronology based on cycles of 49 years, called Jubilees, with each Jubilee subdivided into 7 cycles of 7 years. This unique way of marking time reflects a commitment to sabbatical cycles, deeply rooted in Jewish tradition. Today, the only known complete manuscripts of the Book of Jubilees are preserved in Ge'ez and date back to the 15th and 16th centuries. In addition, numerous citations and references to the text appear in the works of ancient writers and theologians, reinforcing its historical and spiritual relevance over the centuries. The Book of Jubilees not only retells biblical stories, but also provides detailed interpretations and legal insights that shaped the worldview of various religious communities. Its connection to sacred chronology and its presence in different traditions underscore its role as a vital link in transmitting religious and cultural ideas from the ancient world to posterity. In addition to the complete texts preserved in Ge'ez, there is a fragment of a Latin translation derived from Greek, covering approximately 1/4 of the original content of the Book of Jubilees. These Latin fragments, though limited in scope, provide important insights into the textual transmission of the work. Today, the Ethiopian texts, comprising 27 manuscripts, serve as the primary basis for modern translations, such as those in English. Interestingly, the passages in the Book of Jubilees that align directly with verses from Genesis do not correspond literally to any surviving manuscript translations. This peculiarity has led scholars to conclude that the Hebrew original of the Book of Jubilees was based on a textual tradition of Genesis and the early chapters of Exodus that does not match the Masoretic text or the Hebrew text underlying the Septuagint. This suggests the existence of an alternative and independent version of the biblical text in these foundational books. The historian points out that the diversity among manuscript traditions, such as that evidenced by the Septuagint, compared to the Masoretic text, as well as the variants found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, reflects a complex textual reality. In the centuries prior to Christ, canonical Hebrew texts were not confined to a single consolidated manuscript tradition. There is evidence of at least 3 main textual traditions coexisting: the Babylonian, Samaritan, and pre-Masoretic traditions. This panorama reveals that, before the standardization of the biblical text, there was a rich textual diversity, allowing for significant variations among versions. The Book of Jubilees, with its textual peculiarities, seems to fit within this context of plurality, serving as an additional testament to the fluidity and evolution of manuscript traditions in antiquity. This multiplicity of sources not only enriches the understanding of religious texts, but also highlights the cultural and theological dynamics of the communities that preserved and adapted them over the centuries. While some argue that the pre-Masoretic text could have been considered reliable at the time, this idea is subject to debate, with arguments both supporting and challenging it. Between 1947 and 1956, approximately 15 scrolls of the Book of Jubilees were discovered in 5 caves at Qumran. All these manuscripts were written in square Aramaic script, a significant detail that reflects the broad use and importance of this text within that community. In fact, the Book of Jubilees was found in greater numbers at Qumran than almost any other biblical book, except for Psalms, Deuteronomy, Isaiah, Exodus, and Genesis, in descending order of frequency. A comparative analysis of the Qumran texts, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Ethiopian version of the Book of Jubilees, conducted by James Vander, revealed important insights. He concluded that the Ethiopian translation, known even before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, was reliable, accurate, and, in many respects, a literal translation of the text. This study contextualized the value of the Ethiopian tradition as a pre-existing and well-preserved source of the Book of Jubilees, reinforcing its historical and philological relevance. Robert Henry Charles, 1855 to 1931, a renowned biblical scholar, was the first to propose an origin for the Book of Jubilees. He suggested that the author might have been a Pharisee and that the text was the product of a Midrash influenced by the narratives of the Chronicles in the Old Testament. However, with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, this hypothesis was refuted. The finding of multiple copies of the Book of Jubilees at Qumran indicated that its origins predated the emergence of the Pharisees, establishing a much earlier antiquity for the text. This shift in perspective expanded the understanding of the Book of Jubilees as a witness to a more ancient and diverse historical and theological context. It not only reflects the interpretation of biblical traditions by the Qumran community, but also highlights the complex evolution of religious thought during a transitional period between ancient Jewish traditions and Second Temple Judaism. Dating the Book of Jubilees has been a persistent challenge for Old Testament scholars. The oldest available copies, based on paleographic analysis, can be dated to approximately 150 to 100 BCE. However, there is evidence suggesting that its composition is significantly older. Recent studies point to an approximate date of 200 BCE. Even more intriguingly, fragments attributed to the Book of Jubilees and related texts, dated to the 7th to 8th centuries BCE, suggest that its roots may be much older than previously thought. These findings place the Book of Jubilees in a much more ancient historical context, expanding the understanding of its origin and influence. One of the notable peculiarities of the text is its reference to Satan, who is called Mastema. Unlike the Bible, where Satan is identified by various names such as Baal in the Old Testament or Ancient Serpent and Belial in the New Testament, the Book of Jubilees attributes to him the name Mastema. This Hebrew term means hatred, contention, or confusion, emphasizing his role as an agent of chaos and enmity. This designation offers a unique perspective on the character, distinct from the more widely known biblical traditions. Another fascinating characteristic of the Book of Jubilees is its claim of authorship. According to the tradition within the text itself, Moses is said to have written the book during the 40 days and nights he spent on Mount Horeb, awaiting the delivery of the 10 Commandments. The book describes how the Archangel Michael dictated the words while Moses acted as a scribe. Although this narrative is central to the text, its authorship remains a subject of debate among scholars. Many argue that the literary style and content of the Book of Jubilees suggest a later composition, likely influenced by Midrashic traditions and the theology of the Second Temple period. The reference to the direct interaction between Moses and the Archangel Michael reflects an attempt to legitimize the text by connecting it to central figures of Jewish tradition. This detail also enriches the mystical dimension of the Book of Jubilees, presenting it as a work situated between historical narrative and divine revelation. The Book of Jubilees is an ancient work, whose richness of detail and depth make it fascinating and intriguing to scholars and religious figures alike. This text was widely consulted by rabbis throughout history to clarify various themes, such as the names of biblical characters and the identities of their wives, as well as to address broader theological and historical issues. The relevance of the Book of Jubilees in ancient scriptures was so great that it was often cited by priestly circles. The Hasmoneans, for example, incorporated it as a valuable source for the Aramaic Levi document, demonstrating its importance in the religious and cultural context of the time. Although it is a widely respected work, the Book of Jubilees has generated debates and contestations around certain aspects of its content. However, even those who disagreed with some of its interpretations recognized its authority and frequently cited it as a basis for reflections and exegesis of biblical texts. This highlights its central role in the formation of Jewish traditions and interpretations. One of the most notable characteristics of the Book of Jubilees is its approach to angels and their hierarchies. It categorizes angels into groups, such as the angels of the presence, angels of sanctification, individual guardians, and those responsible for natural phenomena. This classification finds parallels with the Book of Enoch, especially in its view of the fallen angels, known as the Watchers. This connection with the Book of Enoch reinforces the mystical dimension of the Book of Jubilees, placing it as part of a literary tradition that explores the interactions between the divine and the human. I invite you to reflect on the richness of this text and its contribution to the Jewish tradition. The Book of Jubilees is not just a historical work, it also inspires theological and cultural interpretations that continue to resonate. The mystery of the Book of Giants. The Book of Giants is an apocryphal work that expands on the accounts found in the Book of Genesis of the Hebrew and Aramaic Bible, much like the Book of Enoch. Similar to the latter, the Book of Giants seeks to provide an explanation for the unchecked growth of evil on earth before the flood. The work also addresses the divine justification for the sending of the Great Flood, showing that God's action was more than justified given the prevalent corruption and violence of the time. It is estimated that the composition of this text occurred around the 3rd century BCE. The text is an antediluvian or pre-flood narrative, recounting events before the biblical flood. The tradition of the Book of Giants was widely preserved in Manichaean literature and is primarily known through texts found in Turfan in the Central Asia region. Despite this, the oldest roots of this work can be traced back to Aramaic manuscripts found among the famous Dead Sea Scrolls, indicating that its early influence was already present in Jewish communities before it became part of the Manichaean legacy. The text not only expands on the details of the antediluvian period, but also offers new perspectives on human and celestial behavior at the time, reinforcing the complexity of the universe depicted in apocryphal and biblical traditions. References to the existence of giants can be found in various biblical passages and ancient texts. A significant example is in Genesis 6:1-4, where the Nephilim are mentioned as the descendants of a union between the sons of God and the daughters of men. Furthermore, other apocryphal texts and ancient writings reinforce this narrative, such as the books of Enoch, Jubilees, the apocryphal Genesis, and the 2nd and 3rd Baruch, as well as the Damascus document. There are also scattered mentions throughout the Pentateuch and in historical books such as Judges, Joshua, and Samuel. The Book of Giants presents a detailed narrative about the origin, history, and fate of these antediluvian giants, as well as their parents, the so-called Watchers. These beings, also referred to as the sons of God, rebelled against divine plans, becoming fallen angels when they crossed the boundaries set by creation. They descended to earth and, in an act of transgression, united with the daughters of men, engaging in lust and generating corrupted descendants. The giants, known as Nephilim, Gibborim, or Rephaim, were hybrids distinguished by their strength and size. These mixed races directly challenged divine authority, fighting against God and his righteous followers. However, their corruption and wickedness contributed to the moral decay of the pre-flood world, which led to the progressive diminishing of the righteous and culminated in the sending of the Great Flood as divine judgment. This narrative, widely explored in the Book of Giants and other related texts, reflects the ongoing struggle between good and evil, highlighting the resistance of the faithful in a world dominated by corruption and chaos. In the Manichaean fragments, these evil beings are generally referred to as demons, although the terms used to designate the Watchers and their descendants often blur in different translations. Collectively, these rebellious races are known as fallen angels, both in apocryphal sources and in some biblical narratives that allude to them. As for the origins of the Book of Giants, it is known that it was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, one of the greatest archaeological treasures of the 20th century. However, the tradition that sustains the text is even older, being known before the second half of the last century. For a long time, the book was associated with the Middle Iran, with some scholars believing it was originally written in Eastern Aramaic. This composition is thought to have circulated among the Manichaeans, being attributed to Mani, 216 to 274 AD, the founder of Manichaeism. Mani was a Parthian citizen from southern Mesopotamia and seems to have been influenced by the thought of Elchazai, a Jewish Christian prophet and visionary who lived in the early 2nd century. The Book of Giants, in its Manichaean version, was probably written in Pahlavi, a script derived from Middle Persian, and was part of the rich syncretic and cosmological tradition characteristic of Manichaeism. This trajectory highlights the cultural and religious relevance of the text, which underwent various adaptations and influences over the centuries, preserving fragments of Jewish, Christian, and Iranian traditions. Some scholars, based on evidence related to geographic distribution and ritual practices, have suggested similarities between the Elsasates and the ancient Jewish sect of the Essenes, which flourished during the Second Temple period. This connection reflects possible shared or parallel influences between both religious traditions. During the 20th century, several discoveries provided new perspectives on the literary evidence associated with the Book of Giants. In 1943, researcher W.B. Henning published Manichaean fragments of this work, found in Turfan, in the western region of China, now the Xinjiang province. These discoveries confirmed historical references to the circulation and use of the Book of Giants among the Manichaeans, solidifying its relevance in the Manichaean tradition. Later, in 1971, an important discovery was made by scholar Joseph T. Milik, who identified several additional fragments of Enochian texts in Aramaic among the famous Dead Sea Scrolls. These fragments showed a remarkable resemblance to the Manichaean edition of the Book of Giants attributed to Mani. Based on this, Milik concluded that the Book of Giants was likely a key part of the first Book of Enoch, reinforcing the hypothesis that it constituted a direct extension of the original Enochian tradition. These discoveries not only expanded the understanding of the spread and influence of the Book of Giants, but also highlighted its significant role as a link between the apocryphal Jewish traditions and Manichaean cosmology. The Aramaic fragments found among the Dead Sea Scrolls representing an Enochian tradition were probably introduced to Mani during his time with the Elcisites. These sources seem to have served as the primary basis for the composition of Mani's Book of Giants, where the legend of the Watchers and the Giants became one of the fundamental pillars of his theological speculations. For many scholars, the fragments found in Qumran confirm that the Book of Giants was originally an independent work, created during the Second Temple period. Among the discoveries made at the site, 10 manuscripts of the Book of Giants were identified, as catalogued by Lauren Stuckenbrook. These manuscripts are known by the designations 1Q23, 1Q24, 2Q26, 4Q203, 4Q530, 4Q531, 4Q532, 4Q556, 4Q206, and 6Q8, and were found in various numbered caves, 1, 2, 4, and 6, at Qumran. These discoveries not only demonstrated the existence of an older tradition of the Book of Giants, but also allowed it to be classified as part of a third group of Enochian works. Until then, the work had only been known through Manichaean sources. However, the fragments found at Qumran proved that the text has much older origins, dating to a period before its incorporation into the Manichaean corpus. This evidence has consolidated the importance of the Book of Giants in the study of literary and theological traditions during the Second Temple period, reinforcing its role as a bridge between Jewish apocryphal narratives and Manichaeism. The origin of the language of the Book of Giants has been the subject of considerable debate. Traditionally, it was believed that the text had a Semitic origin. The discovery of fragments at Qumran strengthened this hypothesis, leading scholars such as C.P. van Andel and Rudolf Otto to suggest that, while the known Aramaic compositions are the oldest preserved, they likely derive from even older Hebrew texts. This theory is supported by the statement of R.H. Charles, translator and editor of the Book of Enoch, in 1906. Charles suggested that the Book of Enoch was built upon the ruins of a Noah saga that would even precede the narrative found in Genesis. The Genesis text, in turn, makes only enigmatic and succinct references to Noah and the events related to the Watchers and the Giants. This line of thought points to the possibility that the accounts of Enoch and the Book of Giants are echoes of an older tradition, deeply rooted in the mythology and cultural history of the ancient Near East. Linguistic analysis and comparison between the texts suggest that these works may have played an important role in the formation of subsequent biblical and apocryphal narratives. Milik himself offered his own hypothesis that Enoch's creation story and account of God's law naturally predate the Sinai Mosaic accounts in Genesis. He saw Genesis 6:1-4, a long and puzzling passage for biblical scholars, as a quotation from what he believed to have been ultimately Enoch's earlier source. Recent research, such as that conducted by Klaus Bayer, suggests that the Book of Giants, parts of which were found in Hebrew in the Qumran manuscripts, was originally composed in Hebrew in the 3rd century BCE. However, the presence of the names of the giants Gilgamesh and Hobabish in the text points to a Babylonian influence. Despite this, This Babylonian origin is contested by Martinez, who argues against such an interpretation based on linguistic and cultural elements. This debate about the origins and influences of the Book of Giants not only enriches biblical studies, but also highlights the complexity of the oral and written traditions that shaped ancient texts. It underscores the interaction between different cultures and the transmission of ideas over time. The historian Flavius Josephus also referenced the Enochian line of thought, which addresses the involvement of fallen angels with human women and the emergence of supernatural beings. In his work Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus asserts that what the Greeks and Romans called giants, titans, demigods, or gods were in fact the sons of God, Bene Ha-Elohim in Hebrew, whom he identifies as fallen angels seeking worship by passing themselves off as gods. This view is also reflected in the writings of the Apostle Paul. When addressing idolatry, Paul explains that worshipping idols is akin to worshipping demons. These demons, according to this perspective, would be the fallen angels themselves. Interestingly, the demonic hierarchy described by Paul, principalities, powers, and spiritual hosts of wickedness, parallels the hierarchy presented in the Book of Enoch, which mentions the spirits of the giants and classes of fallen angels, each with specific functions within this structure. The Book of Giants, a work associated with the texts found at Qumran, explores these ideas in greater depth, offering a fascinating view of the interaction between fallen angels and humanity, as well as the consequences of this contact. The Book of Jubilees, the Book of Jasher, the Book of Giants, fragments of a forgotten past, or pieces of a forbidden history, were they erased by chance or by choice? What about you? Do you believe that these books hide truths that would change everything we know? Or are they just echoes of ancient legends? The answer, perhaps, is waiting to be rediscovered. And you? What do you believe? May God bless you and see you soon.